Within the memory of many of its present inhabitants, this brisk, busy town of 500 people was part of a dense forest. In its primitive state, the place was singularly beautiful, with its forests, lakes, streams, and mountain-like scenery, from which it derived its name. Thus starts a handwritten, historical account penned by a local woman whose first name is Carrie, long forgotten to the rest of the world, having been stashed away in the archives of Oconto's library. Hey sightseers, Sightseeing Sally here. As you can see, Marty and Mocha are nowhere to be found. And that's because both of them are back home. Marty's working on a project and Mocha's likely laying on the back of the couch. Meanwhile, I'm here checking out the sights and sounds of Mountain, Wisconsin. With a population of, I don't know, probably about 1,000. Some sites say 1,275, others claim 860 from the 2000 census, and still others claim only like 238. This is one of those little towns that if you've ever made your way either north or south on Highway 32, you've likely driven by it and maybe didn't even know it. Because unless you've stopped and visited any one of their businesses or camped or stayed in a cottage nearby, you probably have never had any reason to come to Mountain until today. What makes Mountain such an interesting place to visit, besides being able to get your own personal serenade by the frogs, is that, much like the small town of Wabeno that we visited at the end of last summer, Mountain played a huge role in Wisconsin's early logging history. As you can tell from this picture where I stood when I first introduced myself here on the tubes. Taking a closer look, you can see the typical lumberjack boots, the shovel, pine cone, the handsaw that they would have used back then, and of course the trees in the background. And even if you look up there, what appears to be smoke from fires that happened back in the day. And I know I've already covered some logging history with the Wabeno video. If you're curious about that, go check out that video. I'll have it linked for you up above, or you can find it in the description box below. Otherwise, I don't intend to recover some of the stuff that I covered in there. I'm just going to talk about how logging impacted the town of Mountain. And of course, show you some of the historic buildings that are still standing, including the location where this bell came from. And if that's not enough to trip your trigger, you'll get to see some of modern day Mountain's stops, like the little cabin you see behind me. Unfortunately, I can't show you the inside because it's only open Memorial Day through Labor Day on Saturdays. One quick story about the cabin before we move on. In the early 90s, a local by the name of Paul Elby learned of a plan to demolish this log home built by Fred and Augusta Bartz in the 1880s. Knowing its significance to the town's history, with the help of volunteers, Paul dismantled the home and rebuilt it at its present site in the Mountain Fireman's Park. Just think, if Paul hadn't had the foresight to step in, this would be one more historic building lost to the passages of time. 20 years before the railroad would arrive in Mountain, Thomas McAllen would build the first permanent home about a mile west of present-day Mountain on the north branch of the Oconto River. With all the forest land surrounding the area, it was only inevitable Mountain would soon develop as a lumbering town. We're entering into the historic part of Mountain, and we're going to pass by a few buildings before we make our first stop. But before we go any further, I have a couple of quick shout-outs to give. Special thanks goes out to Steve and Lynn from Washington and Joseph from San Antonio, Texas for becoming our latest patrons on Patreon. Yay! And a special thanks goes out to Sue and Daryl for tipping the trip jar. Thanks, guys, for helping us get out to all these awesome places. Now, back to mountains. This road, by the way, now known as Highway W, used to be called Wall Street back in the day because of the huge homes that were built up on it. Remember the bell I showed you in the beginning of the video at the park? Well, if I'm not mistaken, the bell came from here. Built in 1905 and added on in 1914 and 1961, the Mountain Union Free High School was built such that grades 1 through 8 were taught on the first floor and grades 9 through 12 were taught on the second. Wow, that school stands pretty tall and imposing up on this hill overlooking the town. By the way, it's on the National Register of Historic Places and is one of only a few historic buildings still standing here in Mountain. From what I understand, the first school was built, I want to say like 1884, 1886. The dates are a little fuzzy because there's conflicting accounts over which date is accurate. But back then, they built their first school, and from what I understand, it was built log cabin style. Shortly after they built the school, they realized that they were growing at a much greater rate than they anticipated and had more children coming to school than what they originally planned for. They built a new school. Supposedly, shortly after that school was built, it burnt down, which led to this massive structure being built. Unlike some of the towns we visited where the old schools were left standing after they built new ones, this one stands empty because the kids now go to school in Surrey. Looking at the map, you can get an idea of just how far the kids have to travel to go to school these days. And that's because Mountain over time has shrunk in population. It's only more in recent times that it's seen a resurgence, and that's because of the recreational opportunities in this area. Moving along, because if we stand here all day talking about Mountain School, we'll never get to the rest of the places I want to show you. If you notice, I'm doing more driving in this video than usual. That's because modern day Mountain is spread far apart, even though it's considered a small town, small community, and actually the main part of Mountain is in a pretty tight area. There is some spread, urban spread, if you will, not only in businesses, but also of some of the houses and whatnot. Going back to, when the railroad came in, started some of that business sprawl, if you will, because the original part of Mountain and where it was built was not where the railroad ended up being built. And thus, Harry Baldwin, who happened to be one of the first businessmen to really get things rolling here in Mountain, decided to move his general store from the location where he had it originally to being built next door to the rail depot. And I don't know if that is what has led to modern day Mountain's urban sprawl, or if there are other factors that played into it. I just know that Mountain has an area that's in between two signs that says Mountain, and then if you drive farther south and then maybe a little bit more north, you're going to find places that still are considered part of Mountain. Just to give you an idea of where we're at right now, right here is Highway 32/64. 64 goes up north a few miles past Mountain and then cuts over to the west. But that's not really that important for you to know. What I wanted you to know is that here is the highway. This intersection here is likely dates back to the early days of mountain, because if you look right behind me is a historic building that's now a bar called the Schoolhouse Bar. It's actually the building that Harry Baldwin had moved his general store into next to the train depot. That's right. The building that Harry Baldwin built so he could sell his wares, his goods, to those coming in on the train is now a fairly popular, well-known drinking establishment up here in northeastern Wisconsin. Built in 1898, it's interesting that modern-day Mountain has chosen to make this into a community gathering place, so to speak, if over drinks, because back when it was the general store, this is where people came to get their mail, get the town gossip, you know, get informed on things. And it's probably like that still today. And then next to that historic Schoolhouse Bar, you've got this old classic, the Thirsty Buck Saloon. If I remember right, early Mountain had like 3 saloons in its beginnings. Well, I would have to say that modern day Mountain has at least that, especially if you include some of the other establishments in the surrounding area that have at least their address Mountain. I guess it's fair to say that some things will never change, especially considering how Prohibition turned out. Moving on, because as much as I could stand around and talk about Wisconsin drinking culture, Prohibition, and things of that nature, not to mention I could really, you know, go in and catch a cold one myself. We're not, because I need to get moving if we're going to ever finish seeing all of Mountain and everything I wanted to show you. Now you might be wondering why I'm focused in on these rocks in front of what appears to be 2 cottages next to each other. And that's because these rocks have everything to do with how Mountain got its name. Yep, time for another story. A man by the name of A.C. Frost is credited with naming the town. He actually is supposed to have built the first log cabin hotel here. Anyways, if you look around the landscape here, you will find plenty of these types of rocky outcroppings. And apparently, it reminded A.C. Frost of the mountains. Hence, the name Mountain. Or something like that. When I was doing my research, I learned it wasn't quite that simple. This area was actually called Jab Switch because this was the location where they would switch out teams of horses that were going out to the logging crews. One thing I read said that this is where the horses would feed and then move on. In another area, I read that no, this was actually a stopping off point where they would load up for supplies and bring them to the hungry lumberjacks in the woods. Regardless, this was originally called Jab Switch. Then in 1889, the first post office was established in Mountain. Not really sure what it was called at that point. I do know that this area was considered part of the town of Howe. Then in 1891, the town separated from the town of Howe and became known as the town of Armstrong. Finally, in 1898, it became known as Mountain. By the way, in addition to the points of interest I've already shown you here in Mountain, you can take an auto tour down a rustic road here. I've personally have never driven on it, although if it's anything like any other rustic road out here, I'm sure the views are pretty amazing, especially when you get off the beaten path. A couple other points of interest in this general area before we hop in the car and move farther on. There's a little lending library right there, and then an ice cream shop called Scoopers, and then just beyond Scoopers way over there is a place that I like to call the Bigfoot Store. In reality, its real name is Karen's Unique Gifts, which offers custom embroidery. I thought for this next little bit, we'd take a drive north to a place called Cathedral Pines. That way you could see for yourself what the forest was like, or at least get an idea of what it was like back when logging was huge in the mountain area. According to historical records, Fred Bartz, the man whose old log cabin now sits in the town's park, arrived in the mountain area about 1885. Supposedly, Fred lived in an abandoned camp that had at one time been also used as a school. Later, it is said Bartz provided room and board to the men working the railroad, charging $4 a month and keeping as many as 40 men at his home at one time. By the way, for those of you wondering, this would be the same direction you'd be going and on the same highway if you wanted to head to Wabeno. Well, here we are at our first stop. Apparently you can do this whole tour through Cathedral Pines or Cathedral Woods. I'm only making this one stop just so you can get an idea of what the virgin forests look like before logging depleted the forests in the mountain area. Now here's something I didn't know that I just learned, and that is, in the early 1900s, Lucy Rumsey Holt brought her children here to teach them prayers and Bible stories. Her husband happened to be the president of Holt Lumber Company, and because she thought this place was such a sacred place, she persuaded him not to log this place. And so, this stand of virgin timber was never logged off. According to sources, after Lucy died in 1939, her husband dedicated this rare section of woods for preservation in her memory. In 1968, the Holt family sold the land to the United States Forest Service, who now maintains it for public enjoyment. Now, as much fun as it would be for me to go explore more of this tour, I think we're going to move on because it is looking a little bit rainy. Plus I heard a little bit of thunder, and we have a few more stops to make before this video is done. This next stop, some of you sightseers may recognize, as some years ago we headed out here and did a little video up on this spot. It just so happens that this place is also on the National Register of Historic Places. And because of that, I figured the history is significant enough that it warrants being a part of the mountain video. It's been a few years though since I've been out here, and recently I had seen a post on Facebook saying that the road to it was closed. So we'll see. Fingers crossed we'll be able to get to it. Well, we're here, and looks like we might be in luck. Might actually be open now. The road itself seems a little sketchy. Okay, maybe not sketchy, but definitely full of some potholes left over from winter. Maybe even from last fall, from people driving their UTVs up on this road. The roads, the gravel roads around here tend to get a bit washboardy, as we like to call it, from all the use that they get. People rip-roaring through them. Not everybody's like that, but there's plenty of tourists that like to come up and drive their UTVs all over the place up here. Some of them, well, they don't exactly follow the speed limits. Looks like we're in luck. Yay! We got the place to ourselves, sightseers. See? Nobody else here but us. And there in front of me is the Mountain Lookout Tower on the National Register of Historic Places. This is where they had somebody stationed back before the technological advances that we have today for fire detection. But they had somebody sitting up there looking out over the forests for signs of fire, for any indication of smoke rising up into the sky. Built by Franklin Roosevelt's newly created Civilian Conservation Corps, the Mountain Fire Lookout Tower was erected during the winter of 1934 to 1935. Part of an extensive 19-tower network, the tower stood guard over the Nicolet National Forest for almost 35 years. Now on the National Register of Historic Lookout Towers, visitors can climb to the top where they can look out over the forest and see for miles, just as the fire crews did back in the day. Given what you'll learn at our next stop, I think you'll find it rather interesting, the timing of when they built this tower to use as a means for fighting fires up here in the North Woods. But before we get to that, I want to point out just one more thing, and that is, should you decide to come out here and climb the tower yourself, make sure you wear shoes with a really good sole on them, because the last thing you want to do is slip and fall as you're going up and down the stairs. Our next stop brings us south of Mountain, just a few miles, maybe 4 or 5 miles if that. And I'm bringing you there because not only was the location an important part of Mountain's early history as it related to the logging industry, it also happens to be on the National Register of Historic Places, which that in itself makes it significant. But again, it relates to Mountain's early history, thus we're making the little detour south. Since white pine floats, logging crews of old used waterways to easily move the cut logs. Enter Chute Pond. One of the early sites used by the logging crews, there used to be a dam here made of rock and timber, dating back to the 1850s. Up in the distance you can see the second dam that was built, creating Chute Pond. In the foreground you can see this huge tree that just happened to have fallen down. I wonder, I'm no tree expert, but wouldn't it be something if that happened to be a white pine just like the ones they were harvesting back in the day? After the original dam was destroyed, a second one was built in 1937 by the WPA. Apparently, the foundation of the original dam can be found underneath that raging water. Imagine when the water levels are real low, you can still see it. When the last of the logs made their way down Chute Pond in 1910, it seemed the only reminder of the great logging days would be the old dam. Then, something unexpected happened. The dam was destroyed. Now, it's my understanding that the original dam burned down sometime in the 20s, and it's believed that that fire was intentionally set, and probably not for the reason that you think. Apparently, because employment opportunities were scarce in that time, you could get paid $3 per day to fight fires, that a lot of suspicious fires happened back then. I guess living in northeastern Wisconsin during the 20s was the ideal time if you were a pyromaniac. Not long after, the mountain area would see a large portion of its land turned over to the federal government. With the surrounding forests depleted, lumber camps were torn down and railroad spurs removed. A broom factory was started and later abandoned. By November of 1933, it was decided to develop the decimated land through reforestation by forming the Nicolet National Forest. And the rest, as they say, is history.